When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I felt wasn't the icy sting of death, but an unbearable wave of heat rising up through my chest, spreading across my skin like wildfire. My body trembled, not from cold like the last time I drew breath, but from a sensation I knew all too well, one that had once led me to my destruction. The stifling air inside the wooden cabin reeked of aged medicine and dust, and the heavy summer dusk pressed down through the cracked glass window, casting red-gold light across the room like spilled blood. I forced myself to sit up, my muscles aching, vision blurred, the world around me spinning slightly. Then I saw her, Sophia Carter, my sister-in-law, lying just a few feet away on the worn floorboards. Her cheeks flushed scarlet, lips parted as if she were in the middle of whispering something obscene to no one at all. She moaned softly, twisting her body as if trying to wriggle out of her own skin, her thin blouse soaked through with sweat, clinging to her in ways that made me feel ashamed on her behalf. But she wasn't even aware of my presence. Of course she wasn't. She had already lost control. Just like last time. And just like last time, the medicine had already taken effect. Except this time I remembered everything. The betrayal. The humiliation. The brutal, endless winter night. The child frozen to death in my arms. The bitter sting of tears freezing to my skin before I lost consciousness. The last words I heard, Ethan Carter's voice, cold as stone, shouting at me in front of the entire regiment. "You owe her a life, Rachel. Now give it back." And now here I was again, back in the same goddamn cabin, the same suffocating scent of Chinese medicine, the same mistake, except I wasn't about to make it twice. Footsteps echoed outside, heavy boots crunching on gravel. My heart seized. I knew that sound. Ethan was coming. Just like before. Only this time, he wasn't coming for me. He was coming for her. And I would let him. And oh, I would make him. Because I had seen the truth. Because this time, I wasn't the naive wife scrambling into his arms for safety. I wasn't the fool who thought love could protect me from the cold. Biting down on my wrist, hard enough to draw blood, I forced the pain to pull me back to reality. My skin burned, but my mind cleared. Every second counted. I staggered into the shadowy corner of the room, pulling an old blanket down from the cot and draping it around me to hide my sweat-soaked clothes. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as the door creaked open. And then he was there. Ethan Carter. My husband. His uniform was rumpled, his breath slightly ragged from running. But his face, God, his face. So soft, so tender, so alive with emotion I'd never seen him show me in 3 years of marriage. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't be afraid. I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you this time." That's when I knew. He was reborn too. That bastard remembered everything. The way he held her, so gently. The desperation in his voice. The certainty in his eyes. I dug my fingernails into my palms so hard they broke skin. I didn't feel a thing. The pain in my chest was louder. In my previous life, I'd run straight into his arms, begging for help, thinking I was the only one affected by the aphrodisiac. I'd thought he saved me because he loved me. But it was all a lie. He hadn't even seen Sophia that night, or maybe he pretended not to. After he used me, whispered comfort into my ear, held me until dawn, he turned around and condemned me as a whore. Blamed me for her death. For her jump into the well. For every damn thing that went wrong. I crouched deeper into the shadows, watching Ethan lift her like she was porcelain, murmuring sweet nothings. And then he left. Just like that. No hesitation. No thought that I might be in pain. I was just a discarded afterthought. A rag, used and forgotten. The floor creaked again. Another set of footsteps. This time slower. More measured. I looked up to see Captain Daniel Walker entering the cabin. Broad shoulders, sharp jawline. Every inch a soldier. His eyes scanned the room until they found mine, wide with confusion. "You're Ethan's wife," he said, startled. I tried to sit straighter, clutching the blanket tighter around me. My voice was barely a whisper. "Captain Walker, please help me." His face flushed, eyes darting from my flushed cheeks to the blood on my wrist. He looked panicked, like a man caught in a room full of explosives. This isn't appropriate," he stammered. I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because this was the only man in that godforsaken compound who still cared about propriety. "Captain Walker," I said, forcing my tone to stay level despite the heat flooding my body. "I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. I need to get home. Please take me." He hesitated, jaw clenched, then finally nodded. "All right, I'll drive you." I didn't trust my legs to hold me, so I leaned on him just long enough to get to the Jeep. His uniform smelled like steel and lemon soap. Nothing like Ethan's. Nothing like Betrayal. When we reached the house, I opened the door and froze. The sound hit me before anything else, the rhythm, the soft gasp, the low, guttural moan. I didn't need to see it. I already knew. Ethan. Sophia. In my bed, taking the antidote. Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched. "I'm sorry," he muttered. But I barely heard him. My ears were ringing. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I tried not to cry, but the tears came anyway. Silent, furious, cold. That night, as I lay in a hospital bed recovering from the effects of the aphrodisiac, I stared at the ceiling and made a vow. If Ethan Carter loved Sophia so damn much, then I'd help him. I'd help him all the way to hell. And I'd make sure he wore the biggest green hat in the entire goddamn regiment. Let him taste humiliation. Let him learn what it felt like to be discarded. I would rise from the ashes of my old self, and this time I'd burn everything down. I didn't sleep that night, not because the heat hadn't worn off or because of the faint bruises left by my own teeth on my wrist, but because of the raw, burning awareness that everything had shifted, the axis of my world had tilted, and I wasn't falling anymore. I was flying into war. The next morning arrived too quickly, the North Point air crisp with the promise of drama as I walked through the regiment compound, chin lifted, spine straight, every step purposeful despite the whispers trailing behind me like loose threads. I heard them, the judgment, the suspicion, the sharp tongues dressed in gray uniforms. "Did you see her with Captain Walker last night? That Rachel Miller, she's bold now, huh?" I let their words bounce off my skin. In my past life, I had cowered from gossip, tried to explain myself, tried to cling to some decency they never intended to grant me. Not this time. This time, I walked through that courtyard like I belonged to no one but myself. And just as expected, Ethan was waiting outside the unit's main building, his hands shoved in his pockets, his brows drawn into a deep scowl like he'd just tasted something rotten. When his eyes locked onto me, they narrowed, calculating, almost insulted. "You didn't come home last night," he said, low and sharp, like an accusation wrapped in concern. I cocked my head slightly. "Didn't realize you noticed, Captain Carter. Weren't you otherwise occupied?" His jaw ticked. "Rachel, don't start this. You're my wife." "Am I?" I tilted my head, letting the morning sun catch on my cheek, as if even the light was siding with me. "Because I don't remember wife meaning disposable." His hand twitched like he wanted to grab me, shake sense back into the woman he thought he owned, but he stopped himself. Not because of guilt. Because people were watching. I leaned closer, close enough for him to smell the sharp, clean sting of hospital antiseptic still lingering on me. "You want to talk about loyalty? About decency? Maybe save that for your next bedtime story with Sophia." His nostrils flared. "That's not what it looks like." "No." I smiled without warmth. "Then why don't we ask the entire hallway of the officer's dorm who heard it? Or maybe your sweetheart can explain why she walked out of my bedroom in your shirt." Ethan's voice lowered to a dangerous hiss. "Keep your voice down." "Why?" "Ashamed now." He stepped forward, boxing me in against the concrete wall, his body casting a shadow that used to mean protection, but now only reeked of guilt. "You think anyone will believe your version of things? You disappeared last night and came back in another man's Jeep. Do you know how that looks?" I laughed, and it was such an alien sound that even I startled myself. "How it looks? Darling, if we're playing the optics game, you lost the moment you brought her home. You're just upset you don't control the story anymore." I brushed past him and didn't stop until I reached the operations tent, where Daniel Walker was reviewing assignments. His head lifted when I entered, expression unreadable, but his eyes flicked briefly to my face, looking not at the woman who needed rescuing the night before, but at the one who had returned with a blade hidden behind her smile. Captain Walker, I said, voice even. Could we speak? He nodded, and we stepped into an empty side room. The light from the single window hit him just right, emphasizing the scar just under his jawline, a silent reminder of the battlefield, of the grit he carried behind that calm demeanor. You were right, I said before he could speak. They've already started talking. They think something happened between us. He crossed his arms, face calm. Let them. It's none of their business. It is when my husband's using it to smear me. His eyes sharpened at the word husband. He say something? Not directly, I said, but he doesn't have to. People are already stitching their own stories. And Ethan's never been the kind to correct the record when the lie suits him. Silence stretched between us until Daniel finally asked, "What do you want to do?" The question hit me like a match to dry grass. No one had ever asked me that before, not in my last life, not once I was married. I had always been expected to endure, to smile, to give, to bleed quietly. But Daniel Walker stood there, as if I still had choices. I want to fight back, I said slowly. But not the way he expects. I don't want pity. I want justice. His voice softened. Then let's make sure you get it. Words spread faster than fire on dry brush. By noon, I'd been called in by Colonel Thompson himself, the political commissar who ran this regiment like a father guarding a wayward flock. His office smelled of old tobacco and rusted metals, and he looked up from his desk with narrowed eyes as I stepped inside. Mrs. Carter, he began. I've heard some concerning things. You've heard lies, I said, and you're about to hear the truth. And I told him, not everything, God, no, but enough. About the night I was drugged. About how Ethan left me behind without so much as a backward glance. About how I was forced to find my way home with another officer's help, only to find my husband already in bed with another woman. Colonel Thompson didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he sighed, deep and long, and leaned back in his chair. You do understand, Mrs. Carter, how difficult it is to intervene in personal matters. Yes, Colonel, I said. But this isn't just personal. It's moral. And it reflects on the uniform. That got him. He pursed his lips. I'll look into it, he muttered. Discreetly. Which meant slowly. Which meant with room for manipulation. But it was a start. And I wasn't planning to wait around twiddling my thumbs. That evening, as the compound gathered for the weekly meeting at the Central Hall, I made my move. I walked in wearing the only red dress I owned, one I hadn't dared wear in my past life, because Ethan said it made me look cheap. The moment I entered, the air shifted. Conversations dropped. Eyes followed. And then, slowly, Daniel Walker stood from his seat and walked across the room toward me, offering his arm. Rachel, he said, voice just loud enough to carry. Will you join me? With pleasure, I replied. The silence after that was deafening. Ethan stood in the corner, jaw clenched so tight, I thought he'd crack a molar. Sophia sat beside him, shrinking into her chair. But I didn't look away. I didn't break. I had just rewritten the script, and they were stuck playing supporting roles in the story I now controlled. The days that followed moved like the slow grind of metal gears, every interaction a carefully timed maneuver, every word loaded like ammunition. After the meeting where I walked in on Daniel Walker's arm and shattered the illusion of Ethan's pristine little marriage, the entire compound seemed to split into factions, some watching with barely concealed glee, others whispering in corners like the truth might stain them by proximity. But the one who reacted the most viscerally was Ethan himself. He didn't come home for 2 days. When he finally did, it was without warning, slamming the door open like he still had the right to command the space, the man of the house returning to put his woman back in her place. I was standing at the sink, scrubbing a coffee cup with slow, deliberate strokes, and I didn't turn to greet him. Nice of you to remember where you live, I said calmly. His boots creaked across the linoleum. Don't test me, Rachel. I'm not. I set the cup down. You're already failing the test all by yourself. He stood behind me now, his breath too close to my neck. You embarrass me in front of the entire regiment. Did I? I finally turned, meeting his eyes. I thought I just walked into a room. Maybe you're embarrassed by your own guilt. His face twisted, not in anger exactly, but something worse, shame trying to wear a mask of righteousness. You've changed. No, I said, stepping closer. You just never bothered to know me. You were too busy building castles with someone else in my name. I did everything for you, he snapped. I kept this marriage together. I gave you stability, shelter. You gave me a prison. I interrupted, voice cold. And now that I've dug a tunnel out, you're furious that I didn't ask your permission first. He stared at me for a long time, his breathing shallow, his hands flexing at his sides like he wanted to grab something, the past, his pride. I wasn't sure. Finally, he muttered, "You're still my wife." "Not for long," I said, and walked past him, each step echoing louder than the last. Later that week, I filed the paperwork for divorce. It was the first time I held something in my hands that felt heavier than my grief because it was mine, chosen, deliberate. Word spread fast. There were murmurs in the mess hall, glances on the training grounds, but I didn't flinch. I wore it like armor. The day the divorce hearing was scheduled, a quiet tension settled over the entire compound, as if everyone knew something irreversible was about to unfold. But Ethan wasn't the kind to go down without staging his own production. I found out the morning of the hearing that he'd filed a counter-complaint, accusing me of infidelity with Daniel. The accusation wasn't just petty, it was designed to stick, to ruin me in ways that left no scars on him. It was vile, but not surprising. What was surprising, however, was how Daniel responded. He didn't retreat, didn't ask me to deny, didn't ask me to stay silent for the sake of his reputation. Instead, he walked straight into the political commissar's office, requested a formal audience, and declared, in front of 3 senior officers and 2 clerks, that he had escorted me to the hospital at my request, that nothing untoward had happened, and that if any action was to be taken, he would stand by every word of mine as fact. "She's the only person here who didn't lie," Daniel said. "So, if anyone wants to question her integrity, they better start with mine." And thank God that did something to me. Not just the defense, but the unflinching solidarity. He had nothing to gain, everything to lose. But he still chose to stand beside me, when everyone else had once watched me freeze to death, without blinking. I walked out of that hearing with my name cleared, and the first steps of freedom in motion. Ethan's face, when the verdict was read, looked carved from stone.
He didn't look at me. He didn't speak.
He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, the image of a man who'd spent so long wearing his own delusion that the truth had left him naked. That night, I sat on the bench outside the quarters, staring up at the sky that stretched endless and black above North Point. The stars didn't shine brighter for my victory. There was no wind singing songs of justice. It was just quiet. Honest, still, unromantic quiet. And in that silence, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Not because I regretted it, but because I had finally stopped waiting for someone to come save me. And it was lonelier than I thought. Daniel found me there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "You okay?" "I don't know," I said. "It feels like I should be, but I'm not." He didn't offer cliches or promises. He just sat beside me, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the gravel path. Sometimes peace doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something went missing. Like what? Like the person we were when we thought love would save us. My throat tightened. I wanted so badly to believe I mattered to him.
"You did," Daniel said.
"Just not in the way you deserved." I looked at him, and for a second, I saw not just the man who helped me walk when I was too weak to stand, but the man who had been watching all along, quiet in the background, seeing everything Ethan refused to see. And I felt something shift. Not love. Not yet. But something warmer than bitterness. Something like safety. The next morning, Ethan was waiting at the compound gate. He looked like he hadn't slept, suit pressed awkwardly over his stiff posture. "Rachel," he said, the first time he used my name without venom in weeks. "I want to talk." "There's nothing left to say," I replied, stepping past him. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Didn't you?" I stopped walking. Turned slowly. Because the man who didn't mean it would have stopped when I asked him to. Would have thought about how it looked, what it would cost. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't expect to lose. "I didn't lose," he said through clenched teeth. "You were mine."
"Was," I said.
Past tense. Like your rank. like your respect. Like the last shreds of my affection. He flinched. Actually flinched. For once, his silence didn't feel victorious, it felt pitiful. I turned away, not with rage, not with triumph, but with a quiet sort of finality. Because that's how real endings happen, not with explosions, but with a door closing, soft and irreversible. Ethan Carter was no longer my husband. And I, Rachel Miller, was finally, fully mine. Freedom doesn't arrive like a trumpet's blare. It sneaks in on quiet mornings when you wake up and realize you no longer hold your breath out of habit. After the divorce, my world felt oddly still, not empty, but weightless, like walking out of a storm cellar after the tornado has passed and finding the house still standing, but all the windows blown out. There was no grand celebration, no banner waving behind me, just silence and the task of rebuilding. But while I was sweeping the broken pieces of my old self into a dustpan, Ethan Carter was unraveling. The moment he lost the shield of our marriage and the illusion of his integrity, his carefully arranged facade began to crack like a cheap mirror. It started with whispers in the corridors, officers avoiding eye contact, subordinates hesitating before saluting him, wordless pauses that spoke volumes. The suspension from command came swiftly after the divorce, and though the military called it administrative leave pending reassessment, everyone knew it was a polite way of putting him out to pasture. Sophia, once the quiet widow with downcast eyes and borrowed tragedy, now strutted through the compound with a growing sense of entitlement, her lipstick darker, her perfume stronger, as if she believed wearing Ethan's last name would erase the path she took to get it. They held a wedding, of course rushed, underwhelming, barely attended. The state-owned restaurant they rented had 10 tables set. Only 2 were filled, one by confused neighbors and the other by indifferent acquaintances who came more for the food than the sentiment. I didn't attend. But I did hear that Sophia wore a dress Ethan picked for me, Ansia silky cream number I never accepted because it felt too extravagant, and that Ethan looked half ill the entire evening, the shadows under his eyes like bruises from battles no one else could see. As for me, I was busy. Promotions came slowly in the army for women, especially women with controversies stitched into their silhouettes, but I had something better than rank. I had credibility. People began approaching me with small gestures of respect, little nods in the hallway, a softened tone in meetings. Colonel Thompson stopped addressing me as Mrs. Carter and started calling me Ms. Miller, which might seem minor, but in this world, it was everything. Daniel Walker remained steady, a storm contained behind calm eyes and efficient silence. He didn't push, didn't pry, but he didn't retreat either. Some nights we talked long, meandering conversations under dim lights and shared cigarettes, the kind that didn't demand answers but welcomed the silence between them. I began to notice things about him I hadn't before, the way he paused before replying, like weighing each word in his palm, how his hands stayed steady even when his voice cracked slightly when telling stories from the front. He never once mentioned Ethan unless I brought it up, and even then he treated it like a wound I had the right to show or hide. But Ethan wasn't done. He began writing letters not to win me back, but to rewrite the narrative. In his twisted logic, he cast himself as the real victim. Sophia had manipulated him, he said. She'd been the one who orchestrated the night with the aphrodisiac. She had preyed on his kindness, distorted his loyalty, poisoned him with guilt. Rachel, he wrote, I was weak, but not wicked. I was lost, but you were my compass. I didn't reply. I folded the letters into tight squares and dropped them in the trash, not because I wasn't tempted by the apology, but because I had no interest in being anyone's compass again. I wasn't here to guide lost men back to safety. I was the storm now. The tipping point came a month later. I was summoned to the colonel's office, the air thick with unspoken tension, and there, waiting beside him, were 2 officials from the Military Discipline Commission. They'd reopened the investigation into the incident into who had really replaced the herbal tonic in the infirmary with animal estrus medication. And the evidence, they said, pointed squarely at Sophia. She had done it. On purpose. To manufacture a scandal, to force intimacy, to trap Ethan in an emotional obligation. The twist was not just that she'd done it, but that she had confessed it to a fellow nurse in a fit of arrogance, assuming no one would believe a word against her. When the truth broke, It shattered every last bone of Ethan's crumbling dignity. I wasn't present for the confrontation, but Daniel told me later that Ethan had looked like a man cornered by every bad choice he'd ever made, his hands trembling, his voice cracking as he shouted at Sophia, "You ruined me. I lost everything." And Sophia, who once had begged him to protect her, stood still, eyes wide and expressionless, as if stunned by how quickly the tide had turned. After that, their home once filled with forced laughter and artificial warmth turned to ash. Ethan tried to file for quiet separation, but Sophia refused. She clung to him with the desperation of someone who'd gambled everything and refused to accept she'd lost. Their fights became public. She accused him of neglect. He accused her of theft. When neighbors walked by their quarters, they heard things crashing against walls and Sophia's voice raised to an unrecognizable shriek. Then came the night where it went too far. Ethan, drunk, humiliated, and cornered, snapped. A kitchen knife. A scream.
Blood.
Sophia survived barely. She lost an arm. Ethan was arrested, charged with aggravated assault, and dishonorably discharged. His name was removed from every plaque he once admired. His father's medals, once proudly displayed in the home, were packed away by officials in silence. I heard about it from Daniel, who came to me that evening, standing at my doorway with his hands in his pockets, his jaw tight. "It's over," he said. "For him, it's all over." "Good," I replied, but my voice came out quieter than I expected. Not weak, not regretful, just resolved. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, looking out at the streetlight flickering at the end of the block, thinking how poetic it was that the man who once locked me out in the snow had ended up locked behind bars, trapped in a life he'd built on lies. Daniel stayed for a while. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't need to. He just sat beside me as I made tea, quiet and unassuming, until the kettle hissed, and I poured him a cup without asking. "You know," he said eventually, "you never told me what you really want now that it's all behind you." I stared into my cup for a long moment. "Peace," I said finally. "And maybe someone who doesn't need saving or to be saved from." He looked at me then, truly looked, and something in his gaze softened. "Then maybe we'll both get lucky," he murmured. And for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, I didn't feel like I was bracing for winter. I felt like spring might finally be arriving, not in a rush of flowers or fanfare, but in quiet warmth.
A breath.
A beginning. Sometimes vengeance doesn't end in fire, it ends in the slow, methodical uncovering of the truth, like lifting old floorboards and finding the rot that's been spreading for years. After Ethan was imprisoned and Sophia vanished from the public eye, I thought that was it. Chapter closed. But the past, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. It started innocently, enough a clerk from the military administration dropping off a file at my desk, apologizing for the delay in closing my spousal service benefits. Inside, bundled with a formal apology letter, were old payroll records, service memos, and a transfer authorization. At first, I barely glanced at them, but one name Minowa's repeatedly struck through and replaced with Sophia's. My job reassignment, my benefits, even a small grant meant for officers' spouses pursuing technical training, all redirected in perfect bureaucratic clarity to her. And Ethan's signature was on every page. Not just a one-time mistake, not a moment of weakness. This had been systematic.
Planned.
The man who once told me he was protecting me had actually been bleeding me dry on paper while smiling at me across the dinner table. I sat frozen for almost an hour. The documents spread like puzzle pieces across my lap, and I felt nothing. No tears, no rage, just the quiet confirmation of a suspicion I hadn't dared articulate back then. I'd been collateral. Convenient. Invisible. That night, I went to see Colonel Thompson, not to complain, but to ask for access to archived personnel records. He eyed me over his glasses, skeptical but curious. "What are you looking for, MS. Miller?" I met his gaze squarely. "Just answers. Clean ones." He studied me, then nodded. "You've earned that." It was in those archives that I stumbled across something else, something I wasn't prepared for. A disciplinary warning issued to Ethan 5 years earlier, buried under layers of bureaucratic language, citing inappropriate conduct and manipulation of widows' compensation processes. My breath caught. That was before Sophia even moved into our compound. That meant she wasn't the first. He'd done it before another widow, another dead brother, another story twisted to his convenience. I ran my fingers across the signature of a woman named Claire Whitman, the complainant. She'd requested reassignment after the incident. Transferred quietly, her file marked as resolved. No one followed up. I sat there in the archive room, surrounded by silence and rustling paper, the weight of it all pressing down like a vice on my ribs. It wasn't just betrayal, Anna Marie, it was pattern. Exploitation weaponized as virtue. He'd made a career out of pretending to protect women while stealing from them in every way that couldn't be seen on the surface. And I had lived in that illusion, even loved him inside of it. When I finally stepped outside, the autumn air bit into my cheeks, sharp and almost cleansing. I walked until my legs burned, stopping only when I reached the perimeter fence of the base. Beyond it, pine trees stood like sentinels, tall and still. I closed my eyes, let the wind push through my hair, and promised myself that silence would never again be the price of survival. Back in my quarters, I found Daniel sitting on the steps, legs stretched, posture relaxed in a way that only someone who lived with precision could manage. He looked up as I approached, and without a word, he stood and opened the door for me. I hesitated. "Why are you here?" "Because you need someone who doesn't expect you to talk unless you want to," he said simply. And he was right. I didn't want to talk. I just needed presence. The kind that didn't press or prod. The kind that said, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." I made tea again because somehow that ritual boil, steep, pour anchored me. We sat in the dim kitchen, both of us holding our cups like lifelines. After a long pause, I finally asked, "Do you ever feel like your past is a trap you escaped from but part of you is still inside it?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "Every day. Especially when the walls were familiar. Sometimes it's easier to be imprisoned by routine than to face the uncertainty of freedom." "And do you ever miss it?" "No," he said. "But I miss the version of myself I thought I was back then." I nodded, understanding that in my bones. I missed the woman who believed Ethan loved her. Not because she was naive, but because she had hope. Hope was a fragile thing. Beautiful. But when mishandled, it cuts deeper than betrayal ever could. The next week, I was officially reinstated to my original role, and for the first time, given full clearance to oversee a training program for younger wives and spouses entering the military base support network. It was small, but it was mine. A space I could shape with everything I'd learned, not just about systems and logistics, but about power, silence, resilience. And there was something quietly empowering about watching those women listen to men not just hear me, but absorb what I said with the reverence usually reserved for officers in uniform. I told them how to advocate for themselves, how to read paperwork, how to spot the early signs of being sidelined, dismissed, made small. And when I saw their eyes widen with recognition, I knew something vital had shifted not just in me, but in the air around us. We were no longer inheriting silence. We were building something else. One evening after a session, Daniel waited for me outside the small community hall, leaning against his Jeep, hands tucked into his jacket. "You look like a general in there," he said, half grinning. I shrugged. "I just told the truth. That's rarer than leadership these days." He paused. "You ever think about what comes next?" "You mean now that the ghost of my marriage is finally buried?" I smirked. "Not really. I think I just want to wake up without bracing for impact." "That's a good start," he said. "But if you ever want more, not out of fear, not out of revenge, just out of wanting, I am here." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know how I felt, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had given me the space to arrive at my own conclusion without pulling me into theirs. Later that night, I found one last envelope tucked into my mailbox, no return address, the handwriting messy. Inside was a short note. From Ethan. Just one line. "If I had given you what you deserved instead of what I wanted, maybe we'd both still be whole." I stared at the paper for a long time, then set it on fire over the sink. I watched the flames eat his apology letter by letter until only ash remained, floating into the air like everything I no longer needed. Years passed not like waves but like wind over stone, wearing away the hard edges of grief and anger until all that remained was form-defined, shaped, weathered but solid. I never returned to the house I once shared with Ethan. I didn't need to. It had been hollow before he ever left it. Instead, I built something new in a quieter part of North Point, where the air smelled less of war and more of pine and asphalt and rusting fences softened by ivy. There, the nights didn't hum with suspicion, and mornings arrived with the smell of toast, the low crackle of radio static, and a sense of stillness that didn't feel like emptiness. I didn't remarry right away. People expected it because they thought I needed protection, others because they couldn't imagine a woman being whole without a man's name tethered to hers. But I waited. Not for a savior. For truth. And Daniel never pressed. He remained in my orbit, steady and patient, a man who knew the value of silence and the weight of timing. We shared weekends sometimes, slow walks along the river where wildflowers grew like whispers, cups of black coffee sipped at dawn before drills, the comfort of knowing someone was near without having to perform for them. One day, as we watched his niece play in the field behind the community center, he said softly, "You ever think about what it means to start over without forgetting who you were?" I turned to him and said, "Every day. And I think the trick isn't to forget, it's to forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know back then." His hand brushed mine, tentative but sure. I didn't pull away.
I didn't lean in.
I just let the moment sit between us like a question I'd finally stopped fearing. Meanwhile, word from the outside world continued to filter in, slow and warped, like static, through an old radio. I heard Ethan was released early for good behavior. I heard Sophia was living alone in a small town miles away, managing a fabric store, her left sleeve pinned up like a reminder. I didn't follow their stories. I didn't root for their punishment or wish for their redemption. I let them dissolve into the backdrop of a world I no longer needed to measure myself against. The day I finally visited the cemetery, it was neither a holiday nor an anniversary. Just a cool spring morning with enough sunlight to remind me that warmth didn't need to shout to be real. I stood before a small, unmarked grave in the corner of the lot, where I had asked the groundskeeper years ago to bury my son quietly, without ceremony, without anyone's eyes on us. A child lost to winter, forgotten by the world.
But not by me.
I knelt, placing a single white camellia beside the grave. "You never had a name," I whispered. "But you had love. And this time, I remembered. I remembered you through everything." My tears came not as storms, but as rivers slow, certain, and unstoppable. When I rose, I felt lighter. Not healed. Some things aren't meant to be cured but whole in a way I'd never been before. On the way back to my car, I saw a man waiting near the gate.
Ethan.
Dressed in a simple navy coat, shoulders slumped, face older than I remembered, creased not by time, but by consequence. He didn't speak at first, just looked at me like I was both a ghost and a mirror. "I didn't know how to find you," he said. I didn't answer. "I didn't know how to live after you stopped forgiving me," he added, quieter now. I looked at him, at the man who once held my fate like a weapon, now standing as a shadow of himself. "I didn't stop forgiving you," I said. "I just stopped believing you would ever change." "I did change," he insisted, as if saying it would make it true. "But too late." "Maybe," I replied. "But the truth is, Ethan, some people are meant to teach us what not to become. And you taught me that lesson perfectly." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see the apology trembling behind his lips, but I didn't need it. He wasn't here to redeem himself. He was here to confirm that I had moved on, and I had.
Completely.
Without bitterness, without fear. As I turned to go, he said one last thing. "I still think of the night you stood in the snow. I see it every time it's cold." I paused, then said over my shoulder, "I hope you see it every time it's warm too. That way, you never forget who held the winter." I didn't look back. I drove home to a small, weathered house with blue shutters and a front porch covered in potted herbs. Daniel was there, fixing the fence, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the dog barking at a squirrel and getting ignored. I stood there for a moment, watching them, this quiet life that no one gave me, that I had carved with my own two hands. And when he saw me, when he smiled and said, "Welcome home," I smiled back. because for the first time, I believed him. I was home,